before we get into the kind of real nitty-gritty of this teaching on performance-enhancing drugs, I want to introduce you to a few individuals. Okay, so here's one. His name is Armstrong, more of which in a second. So there's one, Armstrong. Let me introduce you to a second. This one's name is Coleman. Okay, happens to be called Christian, but we'll call him Coleman here. This one here is called Jones. Okay, so let me put the wording Jones here. And this one, I was very unsure whether to use this image or not, but I decided I would in the end. This one here is called Salazar. Okay, and I'm specifically referring to this individual here, not this one. This is Salazar. Okay, now the reason I'm introducing you to these individuals is because they've either been found guilty of using performance-enhancing drugs illegally, or they have received some kind of violation, or they have committed some kind of crime based around the use of performance-enhancing drugs. And I'll go through each of them in a little bit of detail. But before we do any of that, I just wanted to sort of share something with you, really, and that is that when I teach any of these lessons, I spend quite a long time trying to think about the intuition that's behind things, okay, or what's the true sort of depth of the study and where does it come from. And I thought about it a lot with performance-enhancing drugs, and the feeling I've come up with is that, let's take Armstrong, for example, we're going to talk about a lot today. At some point, he was a young person, and at some point, presumably, he was 18 or he was 21 or he was 22 or whatever it happened to be, and that young person took a decision, and it went on to effectively ruin them. Okay, that decision, and then they're all different, these cases, by the way, but in this case with Armstrong, that decision to go down the path of performance enhancing drugs ruined him. And I think it's the intuition behind this performance enhancing drugs is that you got to remember, at some point he was a young person who didn't take drugs, but at some point that decision happened, and we've got to look at the reasons why that might happen. But I think what it says to us is that inside every person, no matter who we think they are, there is some balance between good and bad. There is some kind of conflict going on. And I think performance-enhancing drugs really emphasises that point, that people of different kinds can go towards the good or they can go towards the bad. I mean, these are subjective notions, of course. But I think behind all of this, that's important. Now, that's all fine. Let's have a think about why people would choose drugs. So let's go for a reason. Let's go for reasons for drug use. All right, so why would people do it? And again, I want to be clear here that two of these individuals, specifically Farah and specifically Coleman, have never been convicted of using performance-enhancing drugs. It's really important to stress that. I'll come back to those points. Well, by far the most obvious reason someone would take a performance-enhancing drug is they enhance performance. Okay, they enhance performance. I mean, it goes without saying, and we're going to look at some examples in a second, but larger muscle mass from taking anabolic steroids might improve, for example, sprinting. But here's another interesting point. What if you believe that others in your profession are already doing it? You might feel like you have to compete with others. Now, this is where I want to come back to Armstrong, because I think he's an interesting case here. Armstrong entered the sport in, I believe it was in the late 80s, it would have been, maybe early 90s, where it would have been the 90s. That sport was absolutely endemic with drug use. There's no question about that. And this guy, the drug cheat that he is, he entered that sport. And presumably some aspect of his decision was based around the notion of, well, I have to compete here. I'm not giving him a getaway. I'm not giving him a get out of jail free card. I'm just saying that's the reality, and I think it's something to consider. But there is another aspect of this, that increased chance of winning, it can come with kind of fame and wealth. Now, Marion Jones is an interesting case here. This athlete was implicated in the Balco Bay Area laboratory company scandal involving numerous athletes. Britain's Dwayne Chambers was also implicated. And she effectively lied under oath. She made millions of dollars through her athletics career. She won world championships. I don't think she won the Olympics from memory, but she won multiple world championships. She got as close as anyone's ever been to the women's 100-meter world record. No one's got near it for decades. I mean, it's also interesting to consider why it is so low, and the person that broke that world record back in the 80s, maybe, well, let's not go there. But anyway, this person ultimately committed perjury And perjury is lying under oath in a courtroom, and she lied. She went into a courtroom and said she lied on behalf of herself, I think her partner at the time, and also Balco was the company, Victor Conti, that she was involved with. They were providing these sort of designer steroids, and she went to prison as a result of that. Okay, so there's some interesting cases here. Now, this guy here, Salazar, he has been found guilty of misusing what are called TUEs, therapeutic use exemptions, and misrecording the use of certain drugs that are illegal. So therefore, he has been banned for some time. Why did he do that? Good question. Now, let's just address the types of performance-enhancing drugs. And by the way, this list is it's much greater than I'm going to show you here. But the different types people might use, I want to remind you, or probably introduce you to anabolic steroids. Now, first of all, the base part of anabolic steroid is testosterone. Okay, so the male sex hormone testosterone is taken in different formats, and the role of this is to up-arrow increase muscle mass. This is really effective for anaerobic, power-based, speed-based performance. That's why, in the case of Christian Coleman, currently, as I record this, fastest person on earth, as competing, that is, that's why, although he's never been caught for using drugs, and as far as I know, he hasn't used drugs, who knows what the future brings, but the point to make here is that he has missed numerous and repeated testing episodes, and one of the reasons that testing is so important is because this anabolic steroid is a training drug, and therefore out of season or out of performance testing is really, really important. I also want to introduce you to the idea of beta blockers. Strange word, isn't it? Strange term, beta blockers. These can be used by athletes, and what they will do is they will down arrow reduce anxiety. They will cause the hand to be steadier. This could be really powerful with things like archers, for example, maybe even snooker players who need to be accurate and steady-handed and calm. Sort of on the opposite end of that, we have stimulants. Now, there's lots of examples of stimulants. We could be talking about amphetamines, for example. Could even be talking about caffeine, although that is actually legal. But we are talking here about the up arrow increase of alertness. So you could see why sort of people who want a really good reaction time, or games players need to react quickly, might use stimulants to improve performance. And finally, guys, there are others, by the way, but I'm going to introduce you to diuretics. Make sure you get the spelling there. Helps if I write it neatly in that when I say that. Diuretics. Okay, diuretics. And these basically lead to water loss, and they're really good for reducing weight. So think about MMA fighters, think about jockeys, think about boxers, taekwondo fighters. If they've got to make weight to some degree, that's kind of useful for them. Now, to finish this off, and before I come to a sort of conclusion, I just want to introduce you as well to the notion of testing, okay, or performance enhancing drugs testing. So I want to introduce you to a relationship. The global authority on testing in sport is WADA. And just to be clear, this is the World Anti-Doping Agency, but these set the protocols. They do not do the testing. So WADA, which is directly linked and funded by the IOC, which is actually a problem. I won't get into that today, but maybe we can take that further another day. These guys establish the protocol, and the protocol is then delivered by organisations such as UCAD, UK Anti-Doping, or it could be USADA, the US Anti-Doping Agency, or it could be, and there's been big problems here, RUSADA, the Russian Anti-Doping Agency, for example. And it's these networks that deliver that testing. But I also want to just introduce you to briefly two types of testing protocol that could be used. Okay, the one you probably are aware of and know better is what we would call the urine model. Well, I just made that up, actually, the urine model, but it's urine testing. And effectively what happens is a sample A and a sample B is taken at the same time, often out of competition, but also in competition, and A is tested, and if A is proved positive for a substance, B is then tested to ratify the positive result in A. That gives it effectively a very, very valid result in this way. But we've also got what's called the blood passport, and I'll write this in dark red because it's blood, and this is where the blood itself is taken and measured, and changes to the blood over time are recorded. So for example, if someone's red blood cell count, their hematocrit, increased over time very significantly, it might be indication of blood doping or EPO use or various other things. So this blood passport shows changes over time, whereas urine is a snapshot of are they carrying any sort of remnants of drug now. Okay, so this is kind of an interesting thing to reflect on. But I want to take you back right to the start. I want to take you back to Christian Coleman, who, as I write this, has missed at least 3 consecutive tests and therefore has been banned, or they're threatening to ban him. I think they're going to. Armstrong, who won this Tour de France 7 times, although he was stripped of those titles, and he was found guilty of taking what's called EPO, which is something that stimulates red blood cell production. He took testosterone or anabolic steroid. Testosterone. And he also took numerous pain relievers. He also blood doped. Okay, so he did blood transfusions. Marion Jones here, by the way, her name is Marion, as a nice example, Marion. She was involved in what was called the Balco scandal. Okay, and from memory, I believe she was involved with what's called HGH, or human growth hormone. And Salazar here, very recently, as I record this at least, he's been guilty of misusing, I believe, TUEs, therapeutic use exemptions, and also other illegal drugs. And I just want to come back to this point. I believe the interesting thing about performance-enhancing drugs is to find these individuals at the moment they make the first decision to go here. That, at the heart of it, then unveils the reasons someone might do this, what they choose to do as well. Okay, and I think that's a really interesting point to leave you on.